On June 19th, a single sentence traveled across the northern border of Ukraine and landed in Minsk like a dropped match. Volodymyr Zelensky looked toward Belarus and said, in effect, remove it or we will. 1 week. That was the deadline. On the surface, this looks like a quarrel about hardware. A handful of signal repeaters bolted to border towers. Easy to dismiss. Easy to scroll past. But the towers are not the story. The towers are the doorknob. And what Zelensky is really doing is testing whether the door behind them, a northern front sealed shut for 4 years, can still be forced open, or whether someone on the other side has quietly been keeping it unlocked the whole time. Because here is the thing nobody in Minsk once said out loud. The man who received that ultimatum cannot actually answer it. The decision was never his to make. Let me show you why. Start small. Start with the thing itself. The target sits in the Homel and Mahilyao regions of Belarus, signal repeater systems mounted high on border towers. The mechanism is almost insultingly simple. They amplify, relay, and correct the navigation signals of the drones and missiles Russia fires into Ukraine. A signal goes up from Belarusian soil, reaches into Ukrainian airspace, and walks a Russian munition more precisely onto its target, often a target in a residential neighborhood. Zelensky stripped away the convenient ambiguity. Russian-made, Belarusian-made, irrelevant. They stand on Belarusian soil and they kill Ukrainians. Every day this infrastructure runs, the accuracy of the killing improves. That is the visible event, a demand to dismantle some equipment. But watch what happens the moment you ask a second question. Why these towers? Why now? Because the answer is already bigger than the object. 3 days before the ultimatum, Alexander Lukashenko sat for an interview with Al Arabiya and performed a small miracle of reinvention. Belarus, he insisted, poses no military threat to Ukraine. He apologized to Zelensky for past harsh words. Perhaps I shouldn't have spoken that way, given that he is at war. The peace envoy, the misunderstood neighbor. And then Zelensky aimed the ultimatum directly at the gap between that performance and reality. Here is a leader who says he wants no part of the war, while hosting the navigation backbone of Russia's drone campaign on his territory. The contradiction is the whole point. You cannot apologize for harsh words on Monday and guide cruise missiles on Tuesday. But Zelensky didn't stop at the towers. He widened the frame himself, and this is where the real accusation lives. Belarusian oil refineries are quietly raising fuel shipments to Moscow, plugging the holes Ukrainian drones have punched in Russia's own refining capacity. The war machine's gasoline is coming in part from Belarus, and Zelensky's implication was surgical. Lukashenko controls this. He could stop it. He chooses not to. So the equipment dispute was never really about equipment. It is a public verdict. You are not a bystander. You are a participant, and we both know it. Which raises the larger question. If Lukashenko is making a conscious choice to keep helping, why can't he simply choose to stop? Because the choice was sold years ago. Rewind to 2020, the presidential election, crowds in the streets refusing to leave. Until you kill me, there will be no new elections. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya recognized abroad as the legitimate winner, a regime hanging by a thread. Lukashenko crushed the protests, but he could not have done it alone. The Kremlin's security guarantee is what kept him in his chair, and from that day forward, he stopped being a president and became a debtor. The debtor does not negotiate with the lender. Look at his 3 doors and notice that all of them are locked from the outside. Remove the equipment. Tension drops. His "I'm not in the war" image hardens. But Moscow reads it as betrayal. And the punishment is energy prices, credit lines, and the whisper that the Kremlin has begun shopping for the next Belarusian leader. Refuse or stall. Zelensky's threat stays armed on the table. Beg Putin for military protection, which forces Putin to pull resources from other fronts to shield a country whose own army he may not trust. A Ukrainian MP, Ole Dunda, put it brutally. If Ukraine launched an operation, Lukashenko's regime wouldn't survive 3 days, and Minsk could be entered with almost no fighting. Exaggerated probably, but it gestures at something real, a Belarusian army of roughly 65,000 active personnel, low morale, and a memory from 2020 of soldiers who once leaned toward the crowd, not the regime. Independent polling shows over 80% of Belarusians want no war with Ukraine. So the force Lukashenko leans on is not his. It belongs to Putin. And that is the trap in a sentence. The puppet cannot answer an ultimatum because the puppet does not hold the strings, which means the ultimatum was never really for Minsk. But before we follow the strings to Moscow, there's a reason Lukashenko apologized in the first place, and it has a number attached to it. In late May, the commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Robert Magyar Brovdy, spoke straight to Lukashenko. The first 500 targets inside Belarus were already drawn up. Minsk, he said, should not get in the way. A military analyst translated that figure into something the human imagination can hold. 500 targets covers nearly all of Belarus, Lukashenko's own summer residence included. Lukashenko tried to push back. Belarus, he said, also has serious targets with exact coordinates. A few weeks later, he was apologizing on Al Arabiya. That retreat was not weather, it was forecast, because the 500 target list is not the thing he fears. It is the capability standing behind the list. By 2026, Ukraine's long-range strike architecture has become genuinely hybrid and genuinely hard to stop. Drone swarms that slip under electronic warfare, carry low radar signatures, and reach hundreds of kilometers, operated by an estimated 25,000 to 40,000 trained pilots. Domestic Neptune missiles exceeding 1,000 kilometers in range. Flamingo cruise missiles with a 3,000-kilometer reach that covers every square meter of Belarus. Western ATACMS and Storm Shadow, with most usage restrictions now lifted, purpose-built for airfields and hardened depots. And against all of that, hitting the border towers is almost trivial. They are fixed structures. They don't move, can't hide, can't be camouflaged. Their coordinates have been mapped by satellite for years. The repeaters sit in the open air on the upper sections. One precision drone strike disables them, launched from the Chernihiv-Kyiv axis in the northeast, or from the safer western lines through Rivne and Volyn. So the technical question, can Ukraine do this, is settled. The towers are the easiest target on the board, which forces a harder question to the surface. If it's this easy and the equipment kills civilians every day, why hasn't Ukraine done it already? The answer is not about capability. It's about a line on a map that nobody has crossed. For 4 years, there has been one threshold the war has never touched: direct Ukrainian military action against Belarusian soil. Remember what came from that soil. On the first morning of the full-scale invasion, missiles aimed at Kyiv lifted off from Belarus. The most violent months of the war played out on this northern front, and yet Ukraine never struck back across the border. Not once. That was a deliberate choice, a decision not to hand Putin a second country to fight with, not to drag Minsk fully into the fire. Zelensky is now reopening that decision, and he has the legal scaffolding ready. Equipment on Belarusian territory directs attacks on civilians, so neutralizing it is legitimate self-defense. But the political risk is enormous, and it has a name. The moment a Ukrainian strike lands inside Belarus, Lukashenko gains the one phrase he's been denied for 4 years. Our territory was attacked. And with that phrase, the Northern Front, sealed since 2022, could swing open again. So picture what open would actually mean. A new battle line stretching the full 1,084 kilometers of the Belarus-Ukraine border. A line that could bend the entire course of the war, or never materialize at all. Everything rides on the balance of forces along it, and that balance is not what it was in 2022. On the Belarusian side, the picture is loud but thin. Lukashenko announced roughly a third of his army deployed to the border. In May 2026, he canceled large-scale exercises and switched to targeted mobilization, recalling reserve officers. Ukrainian intelligence picked up road construction and artillery positions near the frontier. Russian reconnaissance drone activity routed through Belarus has climbed 20% since the start of 2026, with new drone bases appearing close to the border. Loud. But Ukraine's border service spokesman, Andriy Demchenko, read it coldly. No new unit deployments. Movements are rotational and for show. Russia does not currently have the forces inside Belarus to mount a major assault. A 65,000-strong active army with low morale is not an invasion. The Ukrainian side tells a different story. Since August 2022, the border has been fortified with deliberate patience. Minefields, trenches, concrete barriers, barbed wire, demolished bridges, fresh defenses ringing Kyiv's northern suburbs. The work runs day and night. On June 16th, Chief of the General Staff Syrskyi announced new drone units headed north. The drone wall that throttled Russian advances in the east is now being strung along the northern border, and this is the part that changes everything. In 2022, Russia owned the element of surprise, columns rolling unexpectedly out of Belarus toward Kiev. That surprise is gone. The fortifications are built, the intelligence is live, the early warning system works. Any meaningful movement inside Belarus, Ukraine expects to see coming. So if a full second invasion is off the table, what is Russia actually doing up there? Because the activity is real, even if the army isn't. The answer reframes the entire northern front. It was never meant to be a battlefield. It was meant to be a distraction. Moscow's goal may not be to send a second army through Belarus. It can't, and it knows precisely how ruinous a sequel to 2022 would be. The real strategy is quieter and more clever. Generate just enough threat on the northern border to force Ukraine to pin soldiers and resources to it. Every drone base, every road, every mobilization announcement tugs Ukrainian attention and material northward. And that material is drained straight out of the eastern and southern fronts, where the actual war is being fought. Not full war, permanent pressure. A front that exists to cost Ukraine without ever fighting Ukraine, and Zelensky's ultimatum is aimed precisely at that strategy. By forcing the question, in or out, he refuses to let the northern front stay in its useful, ambiguous, perpetually threatening twilight. Which is why the real recipient of that one-week deadline was never sitting in Minsk. It was sitting in the Kremlin. And to understand why, you have to understand what Belarus has become to Putin, because it is no longer just an ally. It is the last one. Look at the map of Russia's old sphere and watch it shrink in real time. Armenia drifting west after the Karabakh betrayal, Kazakhstan keeping its distance, the Central Asian republics quietly diversifying toward everyone at once. As that sphere contracts, Belarus's value to Moscow inflates, because it is the only door left standing open. And Putin has loaded it with everything that matters: an air corridor into Ukraine, a logistics base and troop rotation platform, and his most sensitive card of all, Iskander-M systems and tactical nuclear weapons, with joint nuclear exercises run in May 2026. Now layer in geography. Belarus presses directly against NATO's eastern flank, Poland, the Baltic states. That position sits at the dead center of Russia's deterrence posture against the West, and the expansion is ongoing. The Guardian reported the 20% rise in Russian reconnaissance drone activity through Belarus this year, new Russian drone bases near the border, and Ukrainian intelligence tracking the Kremlin stretching its long-range drone control network into Belarusian territory. The very repeaters Zelensky is threatening are part of that expansion. Putin is converting Belarus from a defensive buffer into offensive infrastructure, deeper every month. And yet, here is the contradiction at the heart of it. Even Putin does not appear to want Belarus in the war. In that same Al Arabiya interview, Lukashenko let something slip. Putin agreed that Belarus entering the war in any form is absolutely unacceptable. Why would Putin say that, holding all these cards? Because the moment Belarus formally enters the war, NATO's eastern flank goes to full alert. Poland and the Baltics are already postured against the Russian threat, and active Belarusian participation could brush up against NATO's collective defense mechanisms. On May 24th, Emmanuel Macron called Lukashenko directly to warn him against being pulled deeper in. The pressure on Minsk is not only military, it's diplomatic, and it runs through Paris and Brussels too. So Putin wants Belarus inside the war and officially outside of it at the same time. The covert support model. The best of both, deniable help, no NATO trigger. And this is exactly what Zelensky's ultimatum is engineered to break. In or out, no more twilight. Because for Putin, the true nightmare isn't a Ukrainian strike. It's losing control of the dominoes. If Lukashenko removes the repeaters today, this isn't about a few towers. It's the public questioning of Kremlin military authority over Belarus. Remove the repeaters today, and tomorrow someone questions the air corridor. Then the logistics base. Then, eventually, the nuclear weapons. The first domino is small on purpose, but if Lukashenko doesn't remove them and Ukraine strikes, Russia is cornered into defending Belarus, which means pulling resources from the front where it's actually losing them. Putin could try to brand a strike on Belarus as a strike on Russia. But waving nuclear rhetoric over a few signal repeaters on border towers convinces no one die and would unnerve even Moscow's own remaining friends. Zelensky built the deadline knowing every line of this math, which means we now have to ask the most uncomfortable question of all. Does he actually intend to use it? Here is the future, and it forks. Scenario A, the pressure tool. Maybe Zelensky never strikes. The ultimatum may have already done its work. Lukashenko could quietly pull some equipment and announce the demand was met. Zelensky could accept the gray area. When the 7 days expire, Ukraine isn't obligated to fire. It can say it's extending the deadline or monitoring developments and lose nothing. The apology on Al Arabiya, the peace envoy performance, those are already the first dividends of pressure. By this reading, the ultimatum is a lever, not a trigger. Scenario B, the strike. If Ukraine does act, the cost is real and it lands in Western capitals. Washington was already cautious about long-range strikes on Russian soil. A direct hit on Belarus could push that caution to a breaking point. Tighter conditions on weapons, slower support packages. Some European capitals would call it proportional self-defense. Others would call it escalation. And it would hand Lukashenko the magic phrase, "Our territory was attacked." But weigh the proportionality honestly. Ukraine has hit refineries near Moscow, rail lines in Bryansk, military bases in Crimea, and the world did not slide into war. Neutralizing a few repeaters on border towers is smaller than any of those. The targets are military, not civilian. The aim is not occupation, it's self-defense. Ukraine isn't trying to drag Belarus in, it's trying to keep Lukashenko out. Read that way, the ultimatum is a deterrent, not an escalation. The potential escalation, and yet doing nothing carries its own price, compounding daily. As long as the repeaters run, Russian drones strike more accurately and more civilians die. The longer the covert support continues, the deeper Belarus sinks, until the point of no return passes unnoticed. That is why the number was 7. The clock is running right now. For 4 years, one assumption governed this war's northern edge. Belarusian soil was untouchable. Russia could fire from it. Ukraine would not fire into it. That restraint was the rule. The emerging reality is that the rule is now negotiable. And Zelensky just put a price and a deadline on it. The strategic shift underneath is larger still. The repeater is no longer just a repeater. It has become a symbol of the deeper transformation in this war, the slow conversion of a neutral buffer state into active, deniable war infrastructure, and a test of whether deniability itself can survive contact with an ultimatum. The new rule being written in real time is this: there is no longer such a thing as a safely deniable participant, in or out. The twilight is closing, so return to where we started. A few signal repeaters, bolted to towers in Homel and Mahilio, the easiest target on the board, the smallest possible object, and yet that small object now sits at the intersection of everything. A debtor president who can't decide, a patron who can't afford to be dragged in, an alliance watching the eastern flank, and a war being quietly rerouted through a country that swears it isn't fighting. The towers were never the story. They are the doorknob on a door that has stayed shut for 4 years, and someone has just announced on the record and with a clock that they intend to turn it. Lukashenko has 2 paths: remove the equipment and enrage Putin, leave it standing and wait for Ukraine. Both roads lead exactly where Putin does not want to go. That is why this was never an ultimatum to Minsk. It was a message to the Kremlin. So I'll leave you with the question that the next 7 days will answer for us. When the deadline runs out, does Zelensky pull the trigger or does he leave it cocked on the table? A threat more useful unfired than fired. And if a front sealed for 4 years can be reopened by a fight over a few towers, has the real balance of this war already shifted while everyone was still watching the East? Tell me what you think in the comments. We'll keep following this one closely. Presented by the Worldline Network. Thank you for watching.